Why is there a giant pile of salt right on the St. John's waterfront for most of the year, every year? Why are all the cruise ships docked in the harbor in jail? Why hasn't anyone ever taken a power washer to the bunker down on New Gower Street? St. John's, Newfoundland is a very pretty city, but there are a bunch of huge eyesores all around downtown. And depending on where you're standing, you can probably see 3 or 4 right at the same time. We need to talk about these. Old St. John's is built on a hill. The way it developed over the centuries is cool because today it's kind of like a big stadium, with all eyes focused down on the harbor. But if all the people who live in all the houses overlooking the harbor were actually watching a show of some kind, do you know who the stars of the show would be? The big oil tanks up on top of the south side hills. I can't tell you when they were put there, but I'm in my mid-40s and I don't ever remember a time when they weren't there. The sheltered St. John's Harbor is a natural wonder, but one's eyes can't help but be drawn to the stumpy cylinders across the water. They're owned and operated by Irving Oil, and I wasn't able to find out how they managed to obtain that land or how long they have that land leased for, but I was able to find a few news stories from over the years about some small oil leaks or a few small fires, right? Nothing catastrophic, but still. Is this really the only place that these tanks could possibly be placed? Like, ugly buildings are bad enough, and I'm going to talk about a few ugly buildings here in this video. But these abominations aren't even buildings, they're just storage tanks. I can imagine 1,000 better uses for the patch of land that these tanks occupy, and that includes an option to have nothing there at all, but I don't make the decisions. As awful as the tanks are, there is something you can do to easily take your mind off them if they just burn a hole in your retinas. Just swivel your head by around 30 degrees. Cabot Tower sits atop Signal Hill. Now, if you're watching this video, there's a pretty good chance you already know about Cabot Tower, but in case you don't know, Cabot Tower is one of the true icons of the city and worthy of your attention. The Irving tanks are right there, and I'm just some guy who shares videos on YouTube, so I don't have any real solutions to suggest, but there's better stuff to look at just over across the Narrows. Now, if you come with me back down to harbor level, we have the cautionary tale that is known as the Atlantic Place monstrosity. St. John's has tried very hard in recent years to protect some of the history and character of St. John's of old, but in the years following Confederation, like from the 50s through the 1970s, when Atlantic Place was built, so much of St. John's was just thrown away to make way for quote-unquote modern buildings like Atlantic Place or the now old Canada Post building. The Canada Post building replaced a beautiful old building, in my opinion, the most beautiful building Newfoundland has ever known. Just look at this. This was the post office before Newfoundland was part of Canada, so it wasn't Canada Post. The Canada Post building, it's still there, still being used today. Do you know by who? A friggin' Dollarama. The Canadian federal government had the foresight to tear this building down to replace it with what would one day become a Dollarama. And it's a shame that buildings were torn down to make way for this 9-story cube. But did you know that this building was initially meant to include another 11 stories in addition to what's there today? The existing structure was built more or less according to plan with some changes, but the original plan was to build a hotel on top of what's there right now. Here's a rendition from the original brochure describing the project. Of course, a lot of Water Street was destroyed by fire in 1892, so While whatever structures we lost in order to make way for Atlantic Place were certainly more historically valuable and definitely more aesthetically pleasing than what we've been left with today, you can actually see a few buildings that preceded those ones, buildings that look a little different from even the other older buildings on the street. The differentiation in architecture indicates where the Great Fire of 1892 stopped, just a short ways down the street from the Atlantic Place site. The block that I'm talking about is today home to Yellow Belly Brewery and the Celtic Hearth, and it dates back to the 1850s. So as bad as Atlantic Place is, and it is bad, you can contrast that with some beautiful architecture with real historical value, just a short walk down Water Street. So yeah, Atlantic Place is singularly awful. But is there a city on Earth that doesn't have to live with long-term mistakes like this? Big, bad project proposals that have been realized but that should never have been approved? Are there cities anywhere that don't have to deal with dilapidated buildings? St. John's has had its share of these over the years, but happily, many of the more prominent ones have either come down or have been repurposed in recent years. But there's one with a ton of potential, one that looked like it was going to finally receive a new lease on life. But alas, it's the old CBC building on Duckworth Street. I had to look it up. CBC only left this building in 2007, but it looks like the place has been sitting vacant forever. Well, I guess we are approaching 20 years now, though. Wow, time flies. This building sits in an area of Duckworth Street that was an utter dead zone for about a decade. Life buzzed in every direction around this block, but the old Newfoundland telephone building, the open again, closed again Majestic Theater, and this old CBC building were the tent poles for the downtown Phantom Zone. St. John's is a miniature version of the Bermuda Triangle. There was a master plan to fix up the biggest parts of this black hole, but it seems like the specific portion of the plan that involved this specific building slipped through the cracks. It's an ugly building, but please understand that this area was so much worse than it is right now, just 10 years ago. You can look across the street to see the tidy Mix building, and just behind the building you can see the colorful Star of the Sea condo building. And that parking garage that's right next to the building was part of this whole project, and that's less than 10 years old right now. It is still fairly new, and even though it's just a parking garage, it's a big improvement on what was there. There's nothing happening at the CBC building right now, but I have seen that the property may be up for sale, so there is renewed hope that something good may happen. Like, even through the dilapidation that we see today, you can practically smell the potential to make something happen with that site, as the bones of a rare, authentic Art Deco building still appear to be strong. Now, I just threw out the term Art Deco like I know what I'm talking about architecturally. Well, how about this term? Brutalism. Which prominent St. John's edifice would best be classified as an example of this lovely sounding architectural style? I'm not a fan of City Hall, but I can appreciate the effort and thought and intentionality that went into the creation of it. Like, its nickname is the Bunker, and it fits. So it isn't a particularly nice building, but I like how there was an actual architectural concept involved in the plans for this building, as opposed to what typically happens today, where the only consideration related to new building design seems to be how to construct whatever it is in the cheapest possible way. So for many townies, the Bunker stands on its own merits as a worthy eyesore to discuss here, but for me, it's an eyesore for a more specific reason than just existing as a bunch of concrete cubes stacked on top of one another. My problem with the building is that it just looks so dirty all the time. Is it just me? Am I overthinking this? Is it enough to just call it an ugly building and add it to this list of eyesores? I don't know. I honestly don't hate the design. I don't love it, I just don't hate it. But if I was ever walking through the building with a bag of chips and I dropped a chip on the floor, the 5-second rule would not apply here. It's just grimy looking. Now, no doubt, concrete has an ability to soak up and hang on to dirt, but power washers are a thing. Anyway, if you're out for a stroll on New Gower Street and your eyes come across the bunker, just look across the street and give your eyes a break. The historic Majestic Theater, which I briefly touched on in the last section, recently had some work done, and it received more than just another facelift. It has undergone a thorough reimagining, and it's beautiful once again. It's St. John's own little flat iron style building, and it's been around for a very long time, but I don't know if it's ever looked as good as it does right now. Anyway, City Hall itself isn't much to look at, but the discussions and decisions that take place down there are far more important than how the building looks, right? Now, I'm not normally one to defend City Hall, but there is one controversial decision that often gets attributed to City Hall that actually came from Ottawa by way of the St. John's Port Authority. So maybe it's time to give City Hall a break. Not the building, but just the decisions. The decision that I'm talking about is related to the harbor fence. The fence has been a hot topic for a decade now, and I don't expect to see it come down anytime soon, if ever. There are valid arguments for having the fence in place. St. John's Harbor is in fact a working harbor, but a lot of the problems that people have with this fence stem from the fact that St. John's Harbor has literally always been a working harbor, and we had access to the water forever up until about 10 years ago. I've seen a comment online once that said, as far as fences go, it's pretty nice. And I don't disagree with that statement, but I also don't think a fence is the only option to solve the issue down there. Now, as I said earlier, I don't really have another solution for you. I'm just making YouTube videos. But this fence just seems like there was limited thought put into how to do whatever needed to be done in this case. For the other eyesores that I've been talking about so far, I've been able to suggest a couple of quick fixes to better focus your attention on, but this one's just a little bit different. It's hard to suggest a relative alternative because the fence itself is A, pretty long, and B, honestly, on its face, isn't terribly ugly, at least in my opinion. The issue is that it blocks access to the waterfront. So if I had to suggest an alternative or two, there is one small area to the west end of Harbor Drive where you can avoid the fence and visit a restaurant or two, or go for a short stroll on the harbor apron. That's the only sort of area right on the harbor front that's open to the public. So not right on Harbor Drive, but back up around Water Street, there's Harborside Park. I know some people really like Harborside Park, and they do have some nice little musical things happening there in the summer and a few little attractions, but I never really understood the draw. But I'm going to stretch my recommendation to say that if you make your way all the way over to Harborside Park, just turn around and pay a visit to the War Memorial right behind you. It really has nothing to do with the harbor fence or the waterfront, but if you find yourself anywhere near it for whatever reason, you should just pay a visit. It's beautiful. Now, if you do head in that direction and decide to continue your walk east down Water Street, you might find yourself coming up on what is, for me, the most perplexing eyesore of all. The infamous salt pile. Now, no one is going to argue that this salt isn't needed. The problem isn't the salt. The question is, does it have to stay right there? I don't need to elaborate this, do I? Is there no other place in all of the Northeast Avalon that this stuff could be stored until it's needed? The harbor fence is bad enough, but the fence is a relatively new barrier to the waterfront. Like I said with the Irving tanks, I can't remember a time when the salt pile wasn't there. It's a pile of salt, and it occupies one of the most prime locations of the entire city. There gotta be a better place for this. That specific corner of Water Street and Temperance Street is just very odd. It's the beginning or the end, depending on your perspective, of the most iconic street in the city. And it's just blah. One can imagine so much more for this specific area, but there's just this lack of energy there. And a huge pile of salt. There are a few reasons why you may venture down that direction. Work your way up Signal Hill, the Battery. There's a lot of different reasons to be there. So if you do make your way down there, there are two gems of the city that are located pretty much right on that corner that are worth your attention. First, there's a very nice memorial to Terry Fox on the site where he dipped his prosthetic leg into the water at the harbor, where he started basically mile 1 of his run. And it's very worthy of a visit to clear your eyes from the effects of the salt pile. Then just around the corner on Temperance Street, you'll see the Four Sisters houses, which in terms of charm and allure may actually be the 180-degree opposite of a giant pile of salt. Downtown St. John's is unique. It's pretty and is genuinely historic. It isn't a huge area, but it's big enough to keep you busy. You can find lots of resources to help you plan a trip around downtown if you need it. I've seen a couple of good ones, and I've even made a couple of videos myself that I stand by. But I've never seen a guide that explains or even attempts to acknowledge the eyesores that you're going to come across just by strolling around Old St. John's. This obviously isn't a celebration of those eyesores. I wish every single one of them would just go away, but we can't pretend they're not there. And if you're prepared for Jelly Bean Row and George Street, but you stumble onto a giant pile of salt right on the waterfront, at least now you can't say you weren't warned. And now you have a couple of quick remedies for the pain you'll experience by laying your eyes on any of these ugly sights. And you'll also know a little more of the story of this amazing city, all sides of it, even the warts. A city that no one ever, in its long history, has ever claimed to be perfect.